Somebody told you what about Flathead Fords? So today, let's talk about the top 5 myths I've run into when dealing with Flathead Fords. For a little background on me, I've been running an online community of about 30,000 Flathead Ford enthusiasts since 2014, so I've run into quite a few myths around Flathead Fords. So if you're new to Flathead Fords, this might be the perfect video for you, or if you're interested in purchasing a Flathead Ford or getting into the hobby, this video might help you sort of dispel a lot of anxiety around Flathead Fords to begin with. So starting off at number 5, one myth that I hear constantly, generally from people that don't have much experience with flatheads, is that flatheads are not good engines because they constantly overheat. Now, it should be said that Flathead Ford engines do not inherently have issues with their cooling system when the engine works the way it should. They're not designed in a way that leads them to overheating. The problem that we run into is generally a maintenance issue. It is that Ford flathead engines were not built in with safeguards to compensate when certain areas of the cooling system start to break down. So if those areas are working properly, flatheads do not generally have an overheating problem. In our particular group, the topic of an overheating engine rarely comes up. I mean, we're talking maybe 1 or 2 every 6 months. So this is not a common issue. Let's just say, for instance, you're having an issue with your flathead overheating. Here are some tips on what you can check to try and figure out why that engine is having the problem that it is. Because generally, if a flathead is overheating, it is a symptom of an actual problem in the engine. And I know that sounds a little generic because of course there's a problem with the engine. Now keep in mind that your cooling issue could be a combination of multiple parts starting to fail. So always keep in mind that you'll need to go through the entire cooling system before you can really figure out what is wrong. And as you fix 1 or 2 things, it might improve. But if that system is brought all the way back to where it should be within spec, you shouldn't have overheating problems. Looking to diagnose an overheating issue with your flathead, the first thing that we generally tell people to do is make sure you actually are having an overheating issue. I know it sounds crazy, but we've had a lot of people who have come in and been like, I have an overheating issue. And when we really kind of back off and start going through the basics first, we find that their engine isn't technically overheating. They're having issues like, what is the engine doing? Well, the engine, when I park it, is barfing a lot of coolant, so it's clearly overheating. Or when I drive the car, it's losing a lot of coolant, it's clearly overheating. You got to keep in mind that these radiators were not designed to fill all the way to the top. So if you fill that radiator all the way to the top, it is going to purge a certain amount of expansion and then hold at that level. So I've had people that have gone through and rebuilt their entire cooling system and spent all of that money and then found out that it was literally that they were overfilling the radiator. Another issue that you need to check is to make sure that your gauges are properly giving you the right temperature. Because a lot of those older gauges, as they start to go bad, will immediately start pegging that it is overheating when in fact the engine is just coming up to normal temperature. Obviously, another thing that you should definitely check is make sure that your cooling system has been flushed and is clean. A lot of times you're having an overheating issue and some of the problem might be kind of a combination of sludge in the engine, which is basically a giant insulator. and causes that heat to stay in the engine, causing it to overheat. So make sure that you flush the system and get as much of that brown water and crud out of the system as you possibly can. Another thing that you might consider is, and this is a hill I will literally die on, flatheads should have thermostats. So many people argue that you can run a flathead without a thermostat. Yeah, you can run a flathead with a lot of things. It doesn't mean you should. Thermostats do two things. They help the engine come up to temperature, which is what most people are like, well, flatheads don't have a problem getting up to temperature, so they tear them out. The best thing that a thermostat does is it restricts flow through the system. The dual pulleys that are on these flathead engines are a little too good. They tend to cycle the water a little too fast. So if you can put some restriction on that cooling system and slow that water down, it'll have more time in the radiator to cool down. So thermostats are a great restrictor. If you are absolutely dead set that you do not want to run thermostats, I do recommend putting in refrigerator washers or something that just slows down the coolant just enough to leave it in the radiator just a little bit longer. That will definitely help with your cooling issues. Now, it kind of goes without saying that one thing that you should definitely do is make sure that your water pumps aren't leaking, that the bearings are not getting bad within the water pumps. Make sure that your water pumps are healthy. You can generally check to make sure that the bearings aren't going bad by grabbing a hold of the pulley and kind of wiggling it a little bit and making sure that there's no play in that pulley. If there's play in the pulley, then the bearings are starting to go bad on it, and that could have an effect. The other thing is if you have to change your water pumps, make sure and remember that there is a bolt inside that water jacket. So when you pull that tube off, look inside that hole, you will see there is a bolt in there. It's a stupid place for a bolt, but that is where it is. And a lot of times that's where people get hung up on trying to remove their water pumps. Now, if you have a cooling system that is on the worn side, one thing that can contribute to an overheating issue is having the engine slightly out of time. If the timing isn't exactly right on a flathead engine, they do have a tendency to run just a little bit warmer. The other thing that I would consider is make sure that your tire pressure is up to where it's supposed to be. A lot of times lower tires will exacerbate an overheating issue. What exactly happens when you've changed almost everything in the cooling system and you're still having an overheating problem? If the engine is a fairly new build, or the engine has been sitting for an extremely long amount of time, one issue that we have run into quite a bit, especially with people buying industrial flatheads and converting them over to an automotive flathead, is that the engines have a tendency, as most engines do, the flathead a little bit more so, of having casting sand in them. Generally, this was something that was taken care of during at least one or two of the restorations on the engine, but there is a chance that that engine was not dealt with or wasn't used all that much in a way that causes the engine to not shed a lot of its casting sand. So with the industrial engines, we generally see this issue because those engines are generally bolted down to something and they never move. So there's no vibration, there's no heavy use that would cause the cooling system to start flushing out a lot of that sand. A combination of sediment and sand starts building up within that engine, and it's not run a lot with industrial use, so they never really figure out that that engine has a tendency to overheat. So the issue was never dealt with. So make sure that if you buy an industrial engine and you plan on doing a restoration on that engine, that whoever you take it to checks the block for casting sand. So now let's move on to number 4. And the number 4 myth that I generally run into is people assuming that the problem that they're having with their engine is vapor lock. Yes, vapor lock is a possible problem with Flathead Fords, but generally, once we start digging into the problem, it rarely is an actual vapor lock issue, especially with people that are running aluminum intakes. One of the more common things that we find when somebody is complaining of a vapor lock issue is that they're driving the vehicle and the vehicle starts to buck, lose power, something like this. A lot of times it's just an issue of they don't have enough fuel pressure, so the engine is starving out. one of the biggest things that we've run into is not that it has anything to do with the actual intake system. It's actually a coil that's overheating, because a lot of people put coils in places that absorb a great deal of heat. If you mount it to the head or you mount it down low, close to your exhaust system, it's going to really affect the performance of that coil. So you really need to take that coil and separate it from as much heat as possible. And a lot of times we see those vapor lock issues start to resolve. Obviously, if you think that you're having a vapor lock issue, one of the things that you can do is just double check your fuel line to make sure that it's not getting close to your exhaust system or not pressed up against the block where it can start absorbing a great deal of heat. If that is not the case in your situation, and let's say that you're having an issue where if the car sits for too long, you can't get it to start, or you drive somewhere, but once you get there, you're having issues with getting it started again, it's generally a fuel issue, but it's not the issue that you think it is. What is usually going on is the fact that, especially if the vehicle sits for like a week or two, and then you come out and try and start it and you can't get the damn thing to start, what is commonly going on is that the fuel pumps, if you're running a stock fuel pump and you have this issue, the fuel pumps are incapable of pulling from the tank. They are single directional. So it only pushes towards the carburetors. So anytime that it has to pull fluid from the tank, get it up to the pump, you're going to start having problems. So one thing that you can do to try and get around this is to go and purchase an electric fuel pump and put it as close to the tank as possible. Throw it on a toggle switch, flip it on for a couple of seconds before you start the car, let it run for a couple of seconds, and then flip the switch off and drive on with your day. You can either use it full-time, you can use it part-time to just prime the system, but this is a general problem with Flathead Fords, especially the older you get in the Ford era. Should be said that you should have a pressure regulator between the fuel pump and the carburetors. If those carburetors get more than 3 pounds of pressure, they will immediately flood. And the other thing is that I do want to bring up is if you just purchased a new Flathead fuel pump and you're having problems with the carburetors constantly flooding and you don't have a pressure regulator on it, throw a pressure regulator on it. The stock pumps that we have been seeing coming in from China have had a range of check valves in them. We had one shop that went through a line of them because they wanted to double check them, and every single pump had a different pressure that it put out. Some had pressures as high as 9 pounds. And on a system that takes 3, yeah, you're going to flood the carburetor. There's no getting around that one. But if you're still feeling like you have a problem with it, you can easily put a spacer between the intake manifold and the carburetor. But one thing that I would suggest you do is what was done in more of the arid climates in the US that dealt with a great deal of heat. Ford recommended that you could actually put anywhere between 4 and 5 extra gaskets underneath your carburetor, and it would basically do the exact same thing as a $45 to $50 set of spacers. So the studs are generally long enough that you can put anywhere between 3 and 4 gaskets underneath that carburetor. So try that first if you have means to do that, rather than going and buying the spacers and finding out that that's not necessarily your issue. All right, let's talk about number 3 with Flathead Fords. One of the things that we run into quite a bit is the myth that if a Flathead Ford has a crack in it, it's no good. So, newsflash, Flathead Fords left the factory cracked. This is a fact. The design for the Flathead Ford was inherently prone to cracking. The issue is your crack fatal? And most times, that is not the case. You're going to run into a fatal crack when the cooling system dumps into the actual cylinder, or it is exchanging fluid somewhere that it shouldn't. Don't even get too worried if you have a flathead and you go to put it all back together and you start getting weeping out of the top of the head near a head bolt. That is actually somewhat common. You can usually just put a little bit of sealer on that, put it back together, and you're good. There's one type of crack that we have run into that is unfortunately a death nail for a Flathead Ford, and that is when the engine has been allowed to freeze with coolant in it. Generally, freeze cracks are almost always not recommended to move forward with the engine. Even if you just see one crack on the outside of the block, keep in mind that that is the only place that it visibly cracked. And there are going to be countless micro cracks through that cooling system. So it's just a matter of time before problems start to arise in the engine. If you've allowed that engine, or it has unfortunately frozen to the point where it is cracked, I'm telling you, there are extra cracks in that cooling system you will not be able to see. And moving forward with that engine will almost always result in the engine's cooling system failing. Number 2 myth that I generally run into when dealing with Flathead Fords is people saying, oh, well, you can't daily drive a car with a flathead in it. Why not? So, yeah, I mean, this country was built on the backs of Flathead Fords. So though they drove it daily, why can't you drive it daily? There's a give and a take. There's an exchange that you're going to run into. It is not an engine that you can just jump in the car, turn the key, and go. You have to understand how that engine operates, the temperament of that engine. So you have to build a relationship with this pet in order to daily drive it. There's always going to be trade-offs. It is never going to be a small block Chevy or whatever modern engine you're going to put into your classic car. There is a give and a take. And if you're willing to take on the extra maintenance and understand the temperament of the engine, there is literally no reason why you can't daily drive it. If you are looking to daily drive your Flathead, there are certain things that you can do to improve the Flathead's performance. You're never going to get good gas mileage out of it, so you can just throw that out the window. But if you wanted good gas mileage, you wouldn't be driving an antique Ford, you'd be driving a Prius. So I don't think there's all that much of a stretch with saying that. But one of the best things that you can do in order to make a Flathead a little more daily driverable is to switch over to a 4-barrel intake. You're trading off looks for a more practical running engine, but a modern 4-barrel carburetor is going to be miles better on fuel and performance and startability than a conventional set of Holley 94s or Stromberg 97s. Another thing I would consider doing is looking at your ignition system. Try and get rid of your points. If you're daily driving the engine, it is best to run an electronic ignition system. You're just going to reduce the amount of maintenance that you're going to need to do considerably. Obviously, if you have an antique Ford and you want to be able to go at higher speeds, generally the issue is rarely the engine itself. Generally, these are pretty dependable engines once you get them dialed in. If you're going to try and daily drive it, consider that if the vehicle is too slow on the road for you, to redo the brakes so that you have better braking system, so that you can go faster safely. Make sure that your steering system is good. But generally, the first thing that I would do is consider changing the rear end or the rear end ratio so that the engine can go a little bit faster at a lower RPM. Or if you really want to go crazy on it, because this generally takes more fabrication, you can switch over to a more modern transmission. But these engines are wonderful for once you get everything dialed in and you get the right gear ratios and good brakes, you can daily drive these on the freeway without any problem. The number 1 myth and biggest pet peeve of mine when it comes to flathead engines is when a seller of an antique Ford uses the term numbers matching in their sale. When the VIN number was actually introduced and federally required was 1968. That is the first year that Ford actually put a VIN number in a Ford car or truck. So anything that is before 1968 doesn't have a VIN number. It has a serial number. Even into the 1960s, when people were starting to really get an interest in making sure that the vehicle had the original factory engine, the system that they had to use prior to 1968 was to check the date of manufacturing against the chassis and the engine itself. As far back as the Model T, Ford did actually put on most passenger cars, I don't think they did these on trucks, would only put a corresponding number on the tops of the transmissions. So you can match the transmission to the actual car. It is stamped on the top of the transmission, but the engine itself, there is no determining system that matches these two together. So the other issue is that it is highly unlikely that your vehicle has the original factory engine. The reason for this is that at the time that those vehicles sold, in the 1950s all the way back to the 1930s, Ford offered something known as the Dealer Exchange Program. The Dealer Exchange Program was a system that Ford put in place to try and speed up the service departments that they had. And in turn, what you would do is if your engine was tired, which usually happened around 75,000 to 125,000 miles, you would bring your Ford into the service department and they would just yank your engine out and put in a new one. They wouldn't do any repairs to it. They would take that old engine and they would send it back to Ford Motor Company. And Ford Motor Company would tear it all down and see where the failures were in the system so that they could R&D it into future models. This gave Ford the ability to do a ton of research on used items and see where they actually failed. In doing this, most Ford vehicles were done with this exchange program. So yes, it is possible that your particular vehicle was only repaired by a repair shop in some rural area. There is a high probability that if that person had the ability to get into a dealership, the dealership would just swap that engine out. So you're getting whatever engine was sitting in a crate at the back of that shop at the time. That greatly reduces the fact that your engine is the original engine to that vehicle. I always say that it is definitely a red flag when somebody tells you that it's a 1949 Ford shoebox with the original engine in it. It's like, and I know because it's numbers matching. What numbers? There are no numbers to match. The closest you can get to identifying a Ford engine with the vehicle itself is to try and check and see if the date that has been stamped into it kind of corresponds with when the vehicle was made. Should be a red flag to you if they're trying to use this particular selling point to justify a price that they're making, because that seller has literally no ability to actually prove this. Now, if this particular video caused more questions than it did answers, good. That means that you want to know more about Flathead Fords. So please check out myflatheadford.com. And also feel free to leave those questions down in the comments. I'll go through and try to answer anything that I can. Whether you're new to Flathead Fords or you're very experienced with Flathead Fords, if you're looking for a community in which to help others in the hobby or just get the information that you need to get back on the road, please feel free to check out our Facebook group, The Flat Spot. We have close to 30,000 people in the group that are more than happy to help you on your flathead journey.